Hello everyone and welcome back to the Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies webinar series called Designing Sustainable Futures, where we today are focusing on how we are going to create sustainable experiences. In the last session, we heard about anticipating better futures with Suhail Inayatullah, Lisa K. Solomon and Lasse Jonassen. Today our conversation aligns with part 2 of the resource text, which explores systemic design, world building, as methods to engage stakeholders and imagine future scenarios, as well as how design fiction can help designers and leaders envision and prototyping more sustainable futures. My name is Niklas, and I'm a UNESCO co-chair in Futures Capabilities here at the Institute. And I teach at Parsons School of Design in Paris in the intersection of speculative practices and future studies. And I will be hosting this session today. We're fortunate to have 3 experts with us who will bring diverse perspectives on creating sustainable experience from a variety of vantage points. We have Rosanna Vitiello with us. Hello, Rosanna, and welcome. You are renowned for your experiential and participatory design work in placemaking, notable for collective place futures, where you explore how people collectively shape and inhabit future environments. Your team at the Place Bureau has developed a world-building blueprint used for envisioning futures across multiple scales, from South by Southwest workshops in Austin to Global Futures Labs, and we're very excited to hear about this in just a second. Then we have Silvia Barbero. You're a professor and expert in systemic design. You advocate for holistic sustainability approaches that integrate social, economic, and environmental factors. Your academic and professional work bridges both theory and practice in sustainable design methods. Welcome to you, Silvia, as well. And last but not least, we have you, Joseph, the co-author and futures architect, specializing in design fiction. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for being here, and to everyone listening in. Joseph, before we start today's conversation, I guess it's fair that we try to define the terms that we are gonna explore and discuss today. So perhaps I'd like you to present what your take on world building is as a first.
Yeah, with pleasure, and you're absolutely right. It's critical for us to understand these terms because a lot of us in the field use these terms interchangeably. World building is using systemic thinking to identify the social structures, the political structures, the technological systems, the economic models, and even cultural aspects, often referred to in the an acronym STEEP or PESTO. And it's important that world building that actually comes from stories and cinema, fables, the Marvel world, J.R.R. Tolkien. We as futurists can create these worlds, and they have to be robust. They have to be thought through in a deep way.
All right. So if world building can help us design better futures, right? That's the premise. Why do we continue to build within broken systems instead of dismantling them? Rosanna, perhaps you want to kick us off.
Yeah.
So one of the key ideas here is that by constructing rich, speculative worlds, we can inspire real-world, sustainable design actions. So if world building helps us design better futures, why do we continue to build within broken systems instead of dismantling them? Rosanna?
Well, we, within the world of placemaking, are often working within the planning system. And in the UK, that's well known to be antiquated. I mean, many of the policies date back, to over 100 years, and it's ripe for reform. But the very act of building worlds and taking your stakeholders through building worlds actually starts to dismantle them. And I like the term that a fellow placemaker of mine uses, Anupam Yog, which is place breaking. In some ways, you got to get in there and break it before you rebuild it. And I think it's that the approach to world building kind of shines a light on new systems, right? On new possibilities. It reveals that there are alternative ways or kind of small chinks in the armor. So to give you an example, a very practical example, we worked in Huntingdonshire in the east of England, which is a region, a kind of county set within wider Cambridge and Peterborough region. It's a very rural area, full of really heritage market towns, no cities at all within that region. And we worked with them and a team at Prior Planners on a 2050 vision, with hundreds of local stakeholders and thousands of local people. And what we ended up developing was an approach to futures literacy through world building. So rather than leave them a future vision that they then, went on and tried to deal with, the act of world building started to train up all of the stakeholders involved. We created a compass for them and a series of journeys towards the future. And what's been really nice is that they've then taken those journeys and put kind of micro grants behind them to enable 28 local organizations to take these forward, everything from a journey around health to a journey around economy or a journey around local civic pride. So for us, it's the act of like going through, building a different world can start to slowly shake political systems, planning systems, again, like in small ways. And I think that's an important point. You don't change a system in a day without a huge amount of disruption. So if you want to bring people along with you, they have to be small steps.
Right. So Silvia, if you could help us maybe outline some of the barriers, whether they are cultural, economic, or political, that stop us from adopting more radical sustainable methods. Could you perhaps outline a few of those from your perspective?
Of course, the obstacles to society shifting to more radical and sustainable models can be attributed to cultural inertia, economic structural constraints, and political myopia too, which are intervened and create resistance to systemic change. Cultural inertia include comfort zone, short-term gratification, and cultural path dependency, such as the natural tendency of human decision-making to favor short-term gratification, such as the natural tendency of human decision to that short-term gratification. And the main challenge is to accept a sustainable solution that require very long-term investment. Also the fact that economic growth models often conflict with sustainable development, as the current global economic system still use the GDP growth as the primary measure. In contrast, sustainable development often implies reducing resource consumption, limiting overproduction, and that is a challenge to the traditional growth logic. So, for example, also the circular economy can reduce resource wastage. However, in short term, it may reduce the profitability of producing company, leading to reluctance on the part of mainstream capital markets. As a political barriers, I would mention also the lock-in of industry interest, short-term political cycles, and difficulty in coordinating policies across geographical boundaries, such as national pillar industry that have political clout themselves and can influence the advantage of sustainable policy too.
Thank
Can
you,
I add
Silvia.
a point to this?
Yes,
Sorry,
if I
tell
may
me.
first, Rosanna, I would love to play it back to you, because you have, with the Place Bureau's World Building Blueprint, used in context from South by Southwest, as already mentioned, to workshops and so forth. Perhaps, is there a way for you to present us this concept addressing some of the challenges that Silvia just mentioned?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, Sylvia, one of your points around short-term gratification is really interesting, because you're right. It's like, how do you get people to think long term when they get the immediate reward? But one of the nice things about world building exercises, and in fact the world building blueprint that we've developed at the Place Bureau, is the short term gratification that you get whilst going through that process, right? So it's like, how could we use a little bit of the things that are preventing change, and flip it on its head? So I'll give you a little bit of a background to this. So prior to establishing the Place Bureau, I worked for many years in exhibition design and in designing immersive experiences. And what we would do is we would break down the complexity of a place and an experience around a shared culture or a shared story, and start to think about what that would mean for the space, for the media, for the communication, etc. So in some ways, with the world building blueprint, and I'll give you a tour around it in a second, what we're doing is taking those same tools that storytellers, immersive designers use, but we're trying to apply them to a place. Bear in mind that our work is always place focused. And what we do is we give people a framework to be able to imagine this kind of complexities. And at the core, we always place the values. So we ask, what does this world value? And that's really important, because clearly, if you value family, it absolutely shifts, the dynamics of the world, versus if you value money, or if you value nature. Or one of the interesting values that emerged in one of our workshops was euphoria, right? So you can be very imaginative about this. That value at the center enables stakeholders to come together and start to think, okay, what is it that we share in common? But it also helps them understand where there might be conflicts. And then we have 4 different corners to this blueprint. So the first is the place and the setting, which, to be honest, in the world that we work in, placemaking, we're often working with architects, or with master planners, with planners. They often stop there. And what we try to do is to highlight that there's much more to the world than the physicality that we're talking about, or the landscape that we're talking about. So for me, one of the most interesting corners is the next corner, which is around characters. So the antagonists and the protagonists, that and the roles that are really essential in this future world. What are they? Who are my main characters, and how does that start to define what happens in the place? Then we move to another corner, and we talk about our props, or our essential objects. What can we not live without in this world? Which, maybe 50 years ago, and certainly in certain parts of the world, we may say the car. In other parts, we may say the phone. Like, what's going to be coming next, or what's important here? So what are the tools, let's say, that are important in this world? And finally, we move to our final corner, and we talk about the rituals, the traditions, the policies, the things that we continue to come back to and share as a culture. And how do they start to determine what we do in the world? So by cycling through these 4 different kind of areas, and having people collectively think about this, and they do so either by writing, by discussing, but it becomes actually a great mood board tool to start to draw, on elements of production design. You start to visualize that world. You start to really become concrete. And I think what's important here is, often when you're running a force exercise, you're running a workshop with many people, there's a tendency, think about your tools, there's a tendency to kind of put one word down on a post-it note. And somebody the other day, an engineer said, well, how do you avoid these future visions becoming generic, right? Because many place visions are, everybody wants to be sustainable. Nobody's going to say they don't want to be. Everybody wants to be resilient. Nobody says they want to destroy their world. So how do we move beyond it? And what this helps to do is to build a future vision with a greater resolution, if that makes sense. It helps you to break down the world into the various components, and so you can see how various stakeholders around the table might be able to take hold of future elements of that. So there may be one group who are focused on place, yes, master planners, architects, but there might be another group who are focused on policy, and there might be another group who are focused on, let's say, some of the essential, as we said, props, tools, and another who are focused on characters. So I think by highlighting this, the complexity of the various components and breaking it down, you enable people to think more holistically. And one other thing that we always add in is the soundtrack. What's the soundtrack to this world? And again, I think it's important, right? Because we think about experiences here, like how should this and the more you can bring in, the better. What's the atmosphere? And I think that's really a beautiful thing about world building blueprint. It helps you think very much about the atmosphere and gives you all the ingredients to create your story. But it's not yet the story, right? It's just setting the tone. And I'll just give you a concrete example of where we used this recently. We've been working with Fundación USM, a Swiss-based foundation, and the team at For Everyday Life on a project called Futures Lab. And Futures Lab exists to envision and enact or bring to life, brighter futures for the world. But we use this world building blueprint in a session with some really interesting sort of thinkers, from Tirana Hassan, who's a head of Human Rights Watch, director of Human Rights Watch, to Natsai Udry Chiesa, who's the director of Faber Futures, and she designs biolabs. And together they came up with a vision for a future world and focused very much on that character corner. And that character corner started to get them thinking about, well, what are the future roles that we need, in a world that would value, let's say, equity with nature, equity with the natural world. And they came up with a brief to respond to that was to design a department for communities and climate transition. That actually nobody had yet done that with a communities focus. That then we had another policymaker, Daphne Lundy, who's based in New York, and she's worked with the Mayor's Climate Office, respond to. So I think that kind of shows how you can take some sometimes wild thinking with a world building blueprint, provide some structure, and get down to some very concrete briefs that then you can have some serious policymakers or designers or mayors, and anybody really respond to.
Thank you, Rosanna. And perhaps over to you, Joseph. You approach world building through design fiction, right? So how can you potentially elaborate on Rosanna's points here in terms of how fictional narratives or artifacts can encourage various stakeholders to shift from more incremental to transformational moves? Any particular anecdotes?
Yeah, actually an anecdote from work that Rosanna and I did a couple of years ago, where we were working with an organization that was recreating a campus, their headquarters, actually based in Barcelona. And the reason this was interesting was because we used the artifact of a day in the life of a future day. And we actually worked with a number of key stakeholders to put together that day in the life, a typical design thinking exercise projected into the future based on a vision, as we spoke about in our last session with Lisa and so and Lasse, the importance of aligning on a vision. And in this example, the vision was that there would be a more meaningful, more enriching workplace in the community where the actual building and the site was located. And by creating that day in the life, we actually were able to trigger that deeper thinking about, well, what's that world going to be like? What are the policies that are going to be needed in place? What are going to be some of the interactions with community? What will be some of the economic opportunities of that place? And what's really important, and we learned, was that when we are designing sustainable futures and we are creating those sustainable experiences, we need to be, as Rosanna and Silvia said, empowering stakeholders. They may not be designers that are able to actually make the concrete choices of what is that business model, how are we actually going to earn money. And in that session, we were actually using AI to be able to help bring together people. Everyone completed the usual post-it exercise. We took those post-its, put them into ChatGPT, and we're able to generate pretty quickly that day in the life artifact, that day in the life experience. And it was a way of augmenting everyone's design capabilities. So we're seeing how AI is going be contributing to that creation, the co-creation of sustainable experiences in very, very powerful ways.
Yes, certainly it really helps to give body to narratives in a faster and more inclusive way. In a sense, I also experienced that from my time with Parsons. But now we got the perspective from your world-building blueprint, Rosanna, and from an artifact from you, Joseph. Perhaps Silvia, how can we approach or come around world-building from a systemic design perspective? Could you potentially give us an example of how this works from your perspective?
Yeah, sure. The main aspect to have this storytelling technique with the systemic design perspective is the understanding the core system of a project and its directly related system or potentially related systems. It is the first step to understand the complexity and the entire design process. This is the foundation for applying systemic design thinking to build a system world and the key to ensuring that the design can be functional and effective in that sense. So real and fiction's words are essentially a complex system in which different subsystems are present and influence and shape the overall pattern. So it is difficult to represent this complexity using only words. So what we do is always have a storytelling to visualize the multidimensional system. So the system tool can use storytelling to visualize multidimensional system, connection between system, and influence the path and the potential opportunity, but also optimize information communication and enhancing what was said before also about the stakeholder and the consistency and the immersion in a new system. The design process helped to build an engaging overall framework that makes the work more strategic and forward-looking, naturally supporting in the change of this status quo. This approach requires comprehensive capability to collect, process, analyze, and visualize the complex information. So this is one of the core skills needed to become a qualified systemic designer. And in practical project or in educational setting too, the approach usually include some key steps that are, first of all, the data collection framework that is based on the boundary also of the project territory. For example, in care project in an urban community, it is necessary to integrate a large amount of cross-level and cross-domain data information. And these data include but are not limited to also the policy related to the, for example, healthcare or public health and social care security from the national level to the city level and the community level. So also social and demographic information, urbanization, welfare system, community governance, and so on. So the data collection framework should be flexibly adjust according to the project goals. And in that way, we ensure that all the relevant variables are covered and support also the analysis of these different levels of analysis and perspective. Another step is processing that kind of information that is also commonly used in statistics to clean the data that are pre-processed. So the raw data is organized, corrected, optimized, and so we can ensure the quality and the accuracy of that kind of information. This is followed by analyzing the data, mining the connection between data and constructing also the impact path, which require a knowledge background that crosses multiple disciplines and also sensitivity data. And finally, the complex information is simplified and narrated in a narrative story. So in systemic design, data visualization is a way to express information and an important tool to promote also decision-making. Suppose this method is applied to other education environment or practical project. In that case, the data collection framework must be flexible, adjusted to ensure that the information obtained can maximize systemic design and optimize the support in forecasting new world and new system too.
Thank you, Silvia. So if we move on from world building practice, from the various vantage points that you represent, if we then look at, once we've created the world, how are we then gonna shape the system that we're in? We often focus on optimizing existing systems for efficiency, but real sustainability might require more radical transformations, right? So Joseph, what is this obsession with global optimization, and is it preventing us from these more radical shifts that we desperately need?
Yeah, so Manuela and I, we really came to the position that there has to be clarity on what are the basic choices, and you mentioned global optimization, and we're always looking to solve the big problems. But as we just heard from Silvia and Rosanna, these are complex, and depending on the scale that you choose, it is going to have an influence on complexity, and that is going to have an influence on our ability to be able to shape or influence the systems. And in the book, we have a 2x2 grid. And because we're talking about sustainability, and because our intention was to design more sustainable futures, we boiled it down to two axes and two choices. How do we consume, and how do we produce?
Right.
And by making a choice, are we consuming collectively together, or are we consuming individually? Are we producing globally, or are we producing locally? By having a choice, or the opportunity to make a choice within the group of stakeholders, within the space that we're working, that gives us an indication of what are the systems that we need to influence. Because policy systems, as Silvia mentioned, as Rosanna mentioned, the complexity of stakeholders, it's going to be dependent on where do we want to influence. And so that bias towards we want to save the world is something that it may be appropriate, but we wanted in the book to be able to give all of us the opportunity to make a choice, and then to be able to use that choice to create more sustainable experiences.
All right. Silvia, back to you again. From a more systemic design perspective and the complexity around the stakeholders that we are addressing here, how are you working with, for instance, corporations towards more regenerative practices.
Large organization or government that optimization is not the end goal, is to change their perception of the optimal solution and move them towards accepting the adaptability and continuous evolution of the system. By redefining the concept of optimization, building trust, providing empirical support, and flexibly adjust strategy, we can help stakeholders to realize that optimization is a short-term efficiency improvement and the construction of a long-term system resilience. In that way, we can promote their acceptance of a more sustainable development path. So optimization is not an isolated endpoint in systemic design, but a dynamic and adaptable evolution process. Its value depends on its ability to balance multiple interests, adapt to a complex environment, and achieve sustainable development in the face of changing needs. Therefore, a systemic strategy is needed to convince different stakeholders on a common view. So first of all, it is useful to redefine the meaning of optimization and emphasize the adaptation of a system in a continuous balance, dynamic balance. And the fact that we try to optimize doesn't not means an infinite movement towards a specific goal, but the identification of the most appropriate solution between multiple interests and practical constraints too. So therefore, a project optimization strategy must consider different stakeholder needs and ensure that the solution is implementable, scalable, and sustainable under realistic conditions. So demonstrate how to weight short-term gains against the long-term impact from a holistic perspective is crucial to understand the importance of continuous iteration and adaptive adjustment. Second key aspect is building trust. Stakeholder, especially huge organizations or governments, often have established operating models and decision-making frameworks. Therefore, building trust and have an effective communication is the key to promote a change in the mindset itself. So in the early stages of the project, it is important to ensure their deep involvement in defining requirements and formulating also solution. So in that way, the stakeholder views and expectation became part of the design process. These increase their acceptance. So use data and also the data-driven analysis tool to visually demonstrate the flexibility and this optimization path. In that way, the stakeholder can see the potential impact of the different solutions. Last aspect is, in my opinion, the key to get stakeholder to accept this optimization process and that it is not the ultimate goal truly is to provide solutions that exceed their expectation while supporting decision with strong theoretical justification. So during the implementation, the adjustments are made in response to stakeholder feedback. So the solution can meet both long-term goal and practical needs.
Thank you, Silvia. And moving on to you, Rosanna, for a more, you could say, community-oriented perspectives in placemaking, and from your experience in collective place futures, how do you get communities and local authorities to see bigger picture issues or systems level change rather than just fixing existing present-day challenges?
Okay, good. It's a great question, actually, and it's actually the very reason that we started working with this idea of place futures, because we were often brought in and commissioned to help people develop a vision for their place, which naturally, because of the cycles we work in, would take 20, 30 years. And we found that they were focusing on the problems of today, which made no sense because whatever they built was going to be obsolete by the time it came into existence. And therefore, we started to bring in the notion of foresight and of futures literacy as a way to encourage people, to think differently. So I think the methods of doing so are tying quite nicely, actually, with the perspectives from Silvia. So we actually use a 4-step process. I got a little card here. I don't know if anyone can see this, but the first stage for us is empathy. And how first we need to get stakeholders to kind of understand each other's points of view. And I think that's really important, because we need to get a city mayor to think about, the perspective of a 15-year-old kid who's going to inherit that place, as an example. Not necessarily to agree, but at least to understand that their perspective is not the only perspective. And that's really key in opening up the possibilities for future worlds. The second then is insight. And, Silvia, you've spoken a lot about data and bringing data in. Sometimes all it takes is one core statistic. I'll give you an example. We've been doing a lot of work with the Crown Estate in the UK, who own much of the land across the nation. And in a futures workshop, we presented them a fact from the World Economic Forum that in 2050, London is predicted to have the same climate as Barcelona. This single fact shifted their perspective because they suddenly thought, well, if London has the climate of Barcelona, Barcelona is going to have the climate of Abu Dhabi. And therefore, we're going to have a flood of people moving to the streets of London. We have to think, as managing these central London shopping streets, how we might deal with climate refugees, how we might kind of welcome them onto the streets. So sometimes a single fact can be all you need to shift and therefore prepare you for your kind of world building approach and your sense of imagination. And then I think that's important because you want to make sure that the world building that you're doing is based on some core signals of change, right? Otherwise, it is just a storytelling exercise, and we may as well be making a movie, but we're not. We're trying to build a credible, plausible future. So once you've been through that collective ideation and imagination to often solve like very pressing challenges or very real challenges, I think what we found in our experience is that people have a tendency actually to realize their creative capacity by going through that world building process, going through that imagination process. And we use a number of different tools to do so. Give you one good example again. We worked in London in one of the largest regeneration areas in West London with a mayoral development corporation. We ran a writer's room workshop. It's kind of a written form of world building. And by bringing the CEO in with everybody else and then presenting them and saying, look, for the next hour, we're in a Hollywood writer's room. We're writing the future. And this is a guide for our script. It absolutely shifted the power dynamic, even within that organization, that all of a sudden, maybe the most junior person in the marketing team felt that they had the capacity to input into that future as much as the person who was running the show, let's say. And I think that's a really important dynamic is again, shifting who around the table has a say, even if there's a system in place, as Silvia said, to be able to take that forward, it at least helps, I think, understand something that, again, it's going to be more resilient by bringing in greater perspectives. And then finally, and I think this is the most important point, is the impact, right? How do you start to make it real? Because imagination is fantastic. And we use, again, certain tools to help you ask, like, who's missing around the table. One of the important tools that we use is called the advocacy curve. And the advocacy curve is really there to help you understand who are your cynics, who are cynical about the future that you're putting forward, who are your change champions, right, who are kind of with you, and how can you encourage people to, kind of come on board and follow through that change with you. But equally important, how can you also empathize and understand the cynic's perspective, right? Because there's no one solution is going to work for everybody. And I think this is a really important point in bringing people along and getting people to consider what may change. So I think those are some of the tools that we use to be able to to get people sort of shifting through this process. And hopefully that gives you some idea. And actually, I think another really important point in the impact is prototyping. We haven't spoken about it today. We're talking a lot about AI and a lot about theory, but place prototyping is a really great way to just get people to live in the future for a day. So a great example, we worked in Liverpool with National Museums Liverpool, with Asif Khan, the architects, and Theastiges, the artist, and a whole host of community partners who were coming from creative backgrounds, right? They were activist writers, they were theatre workshop and kind of group who worked with food and land. And there was definitely a need to encourage the museum team, the curators, to think differently about this particular site, Canning Dock, which had a deep heritage. And so through the process of working with them all together, so the curatorial team from the museum, the community partners, and the architects, we developed an idea of a 24-hour takeover that enabled the community partners to shift the dynamic in that public space outside the museum, and to create a day in the life of what they wanted to see in this future public space, right? Which ranged for everything from like a sunset ritual to dancing as a way to tell a story to, yes, some more traditional approaches to archaeology that the curators brought in. But what I'm saying is it enabled, again, a shift in testing out the future for a day, getting everybody within that context who are coming from different sides of the perspective, community and museum, to understand what that felt like, and then deciding whether they wanted to take that forward and spend, millions of pounds on regenerating this particular place. So I love place prototyping as a way to be able to try the future out.
Thank you, Rosanna. And to tie in both of your responses and directing it back to you, Joseph, there's like a key tension here that emerges when corporations or governments adopt design fiction. Does it still challenge the status quo, or is it potentially another tool that could end up being perceived as greenwashing?
Well, there's a wonderful article in MIT Technology Review that came out in 2020, and the headline is How Corporates Hijacked the very speculative, provocative process of designing fictions. And you can see back in the early 2010s where organizations like Corning, Microsoft, they would put together these visions of the future, which were not science fiction. They were based on signals of the present, but clearly there was a marketing exercise happening and promoting not just a better future, and one that comes to mind for Microsoft is around education. And you see children interacting with virtual reality and augmented reality. And this was, again, over 10 years ago. So there is definitely a risk. And when we look at the roots of design fiction, it is creating an artifact that provokes us to be able to do, as Rosanna said, to imagine a better future, or imagine the implications of technology. If you watch any episode of Black Mirror, you'll see how those designed fictions trigger significant social change. Nosedive is a great example. One of my favorite ones, The Entire History of You, which is the final episode of the first season, where everyone has implanted a seed which actually records everything that you observe. And then the story, and I won't give any spoilers away, they go back and look at the interactions in a relationship, which, as you can imagine, leads to tragedy. Point being that as designers, and the three of us are trained designers, you're teaching design, we all are going to be looking at how does something help us to visualize the complexity, help us to understand what needs or should be in that preferred future. A great example is the work that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has been doing around jeans redesign. And there's a wonderful case study of how bringing together designers to create a pair of jeans that actually can be recycled from the materials that are used, from the buttons that are used, rivets that are not used, the logo and the tag in the back not used because that influences jeans. Now, I have to be honest, I'm not wearing one of those jeans. I actually don't know where to buy it. So that, in a sense, is real, but it is still a design fiction because it has not been embraced widely by consumers. It is supported, the standards that were created for that project are supported by the majority of manufacturers, but still, I don't know where to buy a pair. And so that's a good example of how important designing fictions, but really designing fictions are, but it's not the end. And as Silvia talked about, it is about building trust, particularly in this example, building trust within a market and with consumers. It is about not just having conversations and good workshops and posted parties with stakeholders, but actually getting them to make decisions to change manufacturing, to change marketing campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. It's a whole different business model that would have to be implemented in order to truly create a sustainable future.
Right. And to build on what you're saying, Joseph, there's been, almost up until recently at least, there's
Mm.
understanding that tech development synonymous with better futures, futuring in and of itself synonymous with better futures, and everyone and their aunt is developing better futures now from various vantage points with the bias that comes with that, I suppose. How can practitioners ensure the integrity of design fiction and actually maintain this critical edge that we appreciate?
I think it's a great question. It's a challenging question. The fact is, it's not easy. It's not easy. There's two, I think, really critical elements. Number one, as we spoke about with Soha, Lisa, and Lasse in our previous session, is converging on a vision of a sustainable future. There has to be that clarity, and that's where that 2x2 is also helpful, that we can agree on, well, how are we going to organize ourselves as a collective or individuals? And that might be, make sense for the culture or the context that practitioners are working within. How do we pursue? Regeneration has become just another buzzword. We actually, when Manuela and I were writing the book, we got feedback, well, nobody's using the word sustainable anymore because of greenwashing. You need to use the word regenerative. But regenerative means that you're in that upper right-hand quadrant, that you were doing, as Silvia is the expert in, circular design. Circular design requires that people actually consume and create things together. It is definitely a much more local exercise than a global exercise. So number one is being clear about what that vision is. And number two, which is going to be the topic of our next session, is how do you bring people together? Leadership is all about that collective, Silvia mentioned, trust. How do you bring people together? When do you bring them together? Who do you bring together? It's not just let's all get together and start designing, because design is hard work. And certainly when systems and data are complex, it's really hard work. So being very, very conscious about how do you bring people together, why do you bring them together, who do you bring together, when do you bring them together, that's a fundamental success factor for maintaining that clarity of designing a sustainable future.
Right. As an educator, Silvia, I have to direct it back to you. I'm really interested here in our final minutes also to hear from an academic standpoint. How do we teach next generations, young students, to use design fiction ethically?
Yeah, first of all, it is important to ensure that the students and team of students understand the ethical boundaries, the social impact, and the responsibility of what they are designing and doing. So when using design fiction, it is important to first determine the applicable ethic scope and the ethical framework. So different discipline, industries, cultural background may have different ethical standards. So a clear ethical benchmarks need to be established, first of all, based on the specific situation. Another aspect is also to cultivate critical thinking of the students and encourage them to understand the ethical impact of design fiction. So incorporate an interdisciplinary perspective on systemic design to help students and team understand the complex social impact and project as a whole and avoid the local optimal aspect to create a more global and ethical responsibility. So that requires, of course, an interdisciplinary collaboration and establish an ethical assessment framework based on key principles of systemic design, and also think about the humanity-centered design, as Don Norman said in his last book too.
And building on that, Rosanna, can you potentially shed light briefly on how participatory and immersive practices and make sure that, how do you make sure that diverse voices are included in those so that the fiction truly represents the community needs and not just top-down agendas?
Yeah, and I think a very important point here is that when we're thinking about building new worlds, the best people to turn to are those who live, let's say, outside the system, outside the mainstream, right? Because in essence, it's like the third culture kids. It's those who are thinking about kind of queer futures. It's those of us who have to code switch. Those of us who maybe see and experience the world in a different way and understand that there's another approach, who are often the best people to turn to because they understand that new systems are possible, right? And so a good example, we worked at the Media Architecture Biennale in Toronto a couple of years ago on the notion of the city of trust, a word that's come up many times. We worked with a method that we've used for many years, the urban lexicons approach I developed with Marcus Wilcox, my co-researcher, and the team at UN Studio, Bruce Ma Design. But what we did was we asked participants to respond to some very real challenges that had been hitting the city around safety and violence in the subway, around cultural gentrification, around the role of tech in the city that, bear in mind, rejected sidewalk labs, and with a group of people who'd come from all over the world, and using AI as a design tool. We use generative AI. We and our world building blueprint. they developed a series of concepts to respond to these very real world challenges. And I think one of the most interesting ones that always catches people's attention, the responses, was in response to how do we avoid cultural gentrification in a neighborhood. And one of the teams came up with an approach to a drag queen police station. And the reason that I think this caught everybody's attention is they were looking at the very real challenge of, like, who do we feel most scared of, or which places do we feel most fearful of, in a neighborhood that is being gentrified. And many of the people around the table came from an identified as LGBT, and said, actually, the police station. So how do we flip that, right? And consider who could keep the peace, let's say, in a neighborhood like this. And the solution was, well, actually, a drag queen. And so then they were able to build out this concept and say, well, what would a drag queen police station look like? How would it welcome people rather than scare them? What would our approach be to calming people down? If we do have to arrest people, how does that work? How would we relate to our neighborhood? And they create these incredible images of the police ending up, playing with kids in a playground in front of the police station. So their notion of building trust was so different to what you would anticipate from a mainstream perspective, which would be about maintaining security. And I think it's a great example of how an alternative perspective on the world can provide a very tangible solution to a real world problem. So I think this idea of making sure that we include others who are living in different worlds, by not necessarily by choice, is the key to helping us understand the plausible futures that might exist as the world around us and the systems around us really start to break down.
Thank you, Rosanna. And to everyone getting their hands on the book, I'd redirect you to page 85, where this incredible case of AI drag queens are to be found. I think it's incredible to see queer principles entering the future space from the perspective of both radical joy and navigating different worlds. But that is a session on its own at another time.
That's a perfect example of a designed fiction.
Absolutely. And as a way of rounding off, Joseph, I would like to give you the last word. Is there a way or an advice, a practical insight that you want to give our audience as a main takeaway from today?
I think what Manuel and I were very passionate about in this part of the book, creating sustainable experiences, is the power of design, the importance of design. Design is actually making things, it's seeing things, it's reacting to things. And that concrete nature of design is different than the imagination of futures. It's different than the emotions and complexities of leadership. Design is the core, but it needs to have a frame of that preferred future, and it needs to be able to actually plant the seeds for engaging people, that leadership component. So it's fundamental, and it's not easy. I'll give a shout out. You mentioned the question about ethics, and Silvia, I thought your response was fantastic. The first week in June, the next Cumulus conference, Cumulus is one of the largest design communities, will be on the topic of ethical leadership in Nantes, where I'm a professor. For a whole week, we're going to be talking about ethical leadership in design. So we're still figuring this out, but it's essential for us as designers, because we're going to be influencing the practical choices. We're going to be influencing people who are going to be using some of these more sustainable practices. It's essential that we have a good understanding of what is the ethical burdens that we need to be aware of in order to ensure that everyone is represented and that choices are made for a more sustainable future.
Thank you. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Rosanna and Silvia. And to everyone listening in and joining our session today. And Thank you, Joseph, for the opportunity to host this session. And congrats on your new book.
Thank you.
Join us for the next and final session of this webinar series. It will be on leading the transition, where we will explore how to foster collaboration, futures-focused leadership, and how to scale systemic change. This will be done in the company of Daria Krivonos, the CEO of Copenhagen Institute for Future Studies, Lois Damhof, who is a UNESCO Chair in Futures Literacy, and last but not least, Shakil Ahmed, who's a transformative educator and futurist. We look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.